Hello, good evening, and welcome to this BIC Hybrids session. There is a bit of Greta in us. Young adults and activism is what our session this evening is all about. This is a new series of conversations by the youth on the BIC platform, and this, in fact, is the second edition of this newfound series. It is conceived, planned, and executed by 17 to 20-year-olds, young adults, that is. The series began by them talking about the issues they care about, starting with the existential question of when are we old enough? And today, it is all about the young and the issues and causes that they care about and their activism and their part in it. We have a bright young bunch with us. We have Anjali Surana, founder of Full Stop, who's joining us virtually from Kolkata. We have Shriya Shankar, founder of Project Sitara Foundation. Rishpanjas Raghavan, founding president, BNP Navayuva. Dhruv Jati, founder of the Bangalore student community. And of course, our moderator and instigator, Sanjit Rao, whose brainchild the whole series is actually. And with that, I hand over to Sanjit.
Thank you so much, Lekha. It's great to be back at the BIC. And in today's episode, as part of the Young Adult series, we will be talking about youth in activism. There is a bit of Greta in all of us. So, a trend that I've noticed, especially in the last 5 to 10 years, is that a lot of my friends, including those on the panel today, have taken up activism. You see a lot of people in my age group, plus or minus a few years, taking to activism and doing a lot of things that you wouldn't typically expect 18 to 20-year-olds to be doing. So it's great to have this panel convened. And today we will be in conversation with four such activists from not only Bangalore, but also Calcutta. And we will be talking what they do, a couple of problems they may face, if they face any problems, why they do it, and just trying to understand why more and more youth are taking part actively in activism. So, as has already been introduced, our panelists of today are Anjali, Shriya, Dhruv, and Rishi, who I can guarantee are going to contribute to this discussion in a very, very good way. Without further ado, let's begin immediately with some opening remarks. We can probably begin with Rishi at the far end over here about what do you do, what is the Navayuva, how do you contribute to the Navayuva, and just let us know about your work in a bit of detail.
All right. Thank you so much, Sanjit. Thank you, BIC, and everybody who's here today. Feels really good to be speaking to an audience in person. I know with all of you after a really long time. I think the question that you asked me is quite broad. So I will briefly speak about what I do and a little bit about how we ended up where we are with me working with Navayuva. I always had an inclination towards administration growing up. So right from the age of say 15, 16, where I wanted to be in my student council, to say at the age of 18, where I wanted some things to be changed with the way the government education department worked. And I wanted some resources. It came out of a personal need for some resources. And I ended up writing to a lot of officials and all the way up to the education minister of the state who was at that point. And somehow I got called on to share some of those recommendations. So right from that young age, I just started seeing again and again that there is a lot of potential within the system, within administration at all levels. So going into college, I think I studied economics, public policy, and currently I'm also a master's student of public policy. So studying all these subjects along with having a practical experience working with different political parties across ideologies at the national level, at the state level, I have been very lucky to get these opportunities. And after all of this work and all of this learning, I decided that the best way to impact local policies, the best way to impact, to have any sort of impact in activism in politics is one, ground up at the lowest of levels, because at the higher levels, there are a lot more things that we cannot control. And two, the other way that we can do it is through local governance, like being with systems that impact just your nearby surroundings. So to conclude my opening remarks, this is the reason with which I joined the Bengaluru Navanirmana Party, which was a citizen-led movement. But specifically, the reason I'm here is to talk about Navayuva, where we believe that there are a lot of people working and impacting our policies and our like local governance on the periphery, but we want youngsters in the mainstream. So the focus of Navayuva is one, to educate a lot of youngsters about the system of governance, our elected representatives, what they do. And two, we not just want to educate everybody, but we want to see youngsters under the age of 30 come up, put their head out, say that they want to contest the local elections, become elected representatives, and show what the youth can do through the system. So that's why I'm here. Thank you so much, Sanjit.
Thank you, Rishi. So it's clear that Rishi is someone who has a really clear vision of what he wants to do. We will come back to you later to figure out and understand a bit more about not only the Navayuva, not only the BNP, but also what your thoughts about youth in activism. Um, Next, we have Shreya. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what does the Project Sitara Foundation do?
Thank you, Sanjit and VIC, for having me here today. So I started Project Sitara Foundation back when I was 18 years old. It came from a space of being very frustrated within the education system that we're part of. I felt like I had 16 years of education, but no translation of it anywhere practically. And that's when, from a space of this desperate need to actually go out there and do something, not just talk, not just rant, but get down, like get your hands dirty and do something. It started off as a little project, which is why it's called Project Sitara Foundation. But soon we saw that, it turned out to be something very sustaining, something impactful. And so we registered ourselves as a non-for-profit organization. What we do is we provide education to children from underprivileged backgrounds. So we've taken the responsibility of being their sole educators or the primary source of education for them. And for students who are already enrolled in Karnataka SSLC, we work with them on our 21st century skill building curriculum. So right now we're based out of Karnataka and working local. I think I relate to Rishi when he spoke about it. That's something that we're very passionate about.
Right. So clearly, I think based on what our first two panelists have said, a decentralized approach to activism is something that they personally prefer. And also another interesting point in both their speeches is that it stemmed from some amount of frustration against the system, some amount of lack of trust in what's happening or lack of happiness with what's happening. And anyway, we'll get back to that shortly. Over to you, Dhruv.
A very good evening to everybody. Thank you, Sanjit and BIC, for having me here. So my name is Dhruv. I study in the Jindal School of International Affairs, currently doing my third year of bachelor's. So I'm also the founder of the Bengaluru student community, a community that effectively emerged out through COVID relief care. So we were an organization that started with just 2 people, and now we have close to about thousands of students, urban Bangalore students, who get involved with us. So the Bengaluru student community, predominantly what we began doing was COVID relief work with the migrant crisis. We also provided 538 beds to the Karnataka government during the bed crisis, which came up when the cases were rising within Bangalore. So post that, we also began implementing our 2021 Sustainable Development Goal number 4 quality education project, which is going to take off in January, in which we are going to create a bridge between urban Bangalore students who can actually make use of their education and give something back to the rural sectors of our country.
Right. So very, very interesting stuff. And as you may have guessed, our panel is full of people who are doing a lot of things at the Bangalore level. But that's not all. We do have three of our panelists are largely Bangalore based or Karnataka based. But last but not the least, we have Anjali all the way from Calcutta, who works with menstrual access, awareness, and a whole bunch of things. So Anjali, please do introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for your kind words, and thank you once again for having me here. I hope whoever is watching here is staying positive and testing negative during these trying times. I'm just so honored to be amongst a cohort of such amazing youth panelists that make me so sort of hopeful for the future. A little about myself. I'm a high school senior from Calcutta. I'm the founder of Full Stop Organization. We're on a mission to redefine and reimagine how the world looks at periods. And we do that by improving awareness, access, and advocacy efforts in the menstrual health and hygiene space under the sort of larger umbrella of achieving a more gender equal world. Um, I think I started Full Stop because of how stigmatized this issue was in my community, and no NGO or no initiatives working to destigmatize the issue. I used like the same brand of sanitary pads for 4 years, which was Whisper, and I think that's what I was conditioned to do. You know, when I got cramps, I whispered. When I needed a pad, I whispered. I didn't raise my voice, I whispered. So I think I started Full Stop a little over a year back, but I think I've been working in the space for a little longer. I remember I started in the ground in the at the grassroots level by telling my friends that you don't have to hide the tampon on the underside of your sleeves on the way to the washroom. I told um, girls who didn't know what menstrual products were because they were because they used to use newspapers and rags and socks, that this is the adequate hygiene measures that you're supposed to take. I remember speaking to doctors who denied healthcare to a trans person, and trying to explain that not all those who menstruate are women. And that's when I started Full Stop to break this taboo on a larger scale. So today we're a youth-led organization with over 100 volunteers from across the globe, just trying to just trying to change, like facilitate healthy conversations around periods, and trying to raise and raised eyebrows that follow "I'm a feminist."
Wow, a very impactful opening speech, if I can call it that. And I think what's really interesting in Anjali's case is that she's barely 18, the youngest on the panel, and she already is leading an organization with, as she just mentioned, over 100 people across the globe. And I think that's really, really inspirational, and it's a really great thing that she's doing. So Anjali, let me just ask you a question. So you mentioned, you brought up how it's a taboo topic, especially in countries like India. So how did you get into this despite it being a taboo topic? How was it when probably your friends, family found out that you were doing something in the menstrual access space? Was it hard? Was it sort of difficult at first, or was it in your case for you? Were you lucky enough to actually have a family that was, completely fine with it? And how do you manage dealing with such a sensitive issue?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's such a amazing question. So definitely it wasn't a cakewalk, but I think a lot of the older generations, and I think what sets Gen Z apart is our ability to recognize the daily opportunities we get to make changes. And I think the older generations generally see change making as more complex. And that's why I want to steer clear away from it entirely. So I knew I wouldn't be able to make all the change that the world needed, but I knew that the world needed all the change that I could bring about. So as I mentioned, it started with, baby steps, and we're still taking baby steps. Hopefully we'll turn them into leaps someday. Um, but I think I just recognized that whatever change, as I mentioned, whatever change I can bring, it's for the better. I just need to do my little bit. So yeah, in the beginning we started doing smaller fundraisers, to get to so that we can host distribution drives with underprivileged menstruators, um, and at the intersection of and I think it's really important to also acknowledge that, um, when I say that I work in the menstrual health and hygiene space, I can't single that out from other issues such as LGBTQ plus rights, such as minority rights, such as climate change, because I think in an increasingly symbiotic and intersectional world, I'm working, for example, when I'm distributing eco-friendly sanitary products, I'm working for gender rights, but I'm also working for climate change at the same point. When I'm talking to, when I'm trying to increase awareness about how not all those who menstruate are women, I'm also championing LGBTQ plus rights. So, which is why I think it was a lot easier to garner support from the community, from cis men who don't menstruate, right? So yeah, it definitely wasn't easy because I don't think periods were a conversation that people were ready to have. But I think that's all the more reason why I had to sort of spark those conversations. I am very privileged in the sense that the community I belong to are more moderate, progressive, or liberal leaning, which is why I didn't really have to, worry a lot about any adverse consequence or violence even that I could have faced, that many people do face because of the communities that they belong to. So I'd recognize my privilege when I say that, I had the platforms to comfortably voice my opinions. Um, that said, it definitely is never a cakewalk, and there's a lot more to the picture than what you see on like our social media or our website. But at the same time, I do come from a lot of privilege. I go to an English medium school. I didn't have to support my family per se at this point, so I could devote time to full stop. Um, I had the social capital to be doing the work that I do, and I had a community that eventually supported. If not everybody, I was able to garner support. So yeah.
Absolutely. So I think it's quite interesting how you mentioned that you had privilege, and I think uh, almost all of us on this panel as well agree when we say that at some level we all are privileged and come from a privileged background, be it financially or socially or on a whole bunch of aspects. So my question to you would be on a larger case of youth and activism. Do you think privilege is often a necessity for people to get into activism? Because when I say, is it a necessity? Is it difficult for people without privilege to get into activism? Or do you think that it's equally easy for them? And do you think that it's the role of those who are more privileged like us to probably be at least starting out these services? Because at the end of the day, these things do cost a lot of money. You have to be able to raise funds. And how can 16-year-olds or 17-year-olds be able to raise funds to effectively run campaigns? So do you think privilege at any level plays an important role when it comes to the question of youth and activism?
Right. I don't think we need privilege. It makes it a lot easier, but I think what's very important is for us to acknowledge that privilege. Um, so when I started off, I think the first two fundraisers, I was dependent on my social capital, on my like friends and my family who can sort of donate, right? But today, I think more than 90% of our donations come from people I never knew. But to get the ball rolling, to get full stop the momentum that it needed, I use my social capital, and that's not something everybody has, right? So privilege definitely plays such a huge role. I think achieving something young is a product of the privilege you're born into and the kind of exposure you get resulting from that privilege. And it's super important to acknowledge that. That said, I think it's very important as youth activists to, as I said, acknowledge that privilege, but also not take the stage away from those who don't come from the kind of privilege that you do. So while I am talking about, trans men who menstruate or Dalit women who menstruate, I'm doing that from a point of privilege, and I don't want to, because I don't want to take the stage away from those with the lived experiences that I don't have, right? So I think it's very important that instead of talking for them, you talk to them, that their voices are uplifted, that and I think on a larger scale as well, even when when policymakers make decisions, it's important that they're included at the table, at the forefront of the table, and not on some folding chair 5 feet away from the table, because they're the ones with the lived experiences. They're the ones who I'm sure your policy is going to impact the most. And yeah, like it's important for youth activists to acknowledge when they're adding to the conversation and when they're just adding to the noise, right? Like, say something when you have something to say. Don't say for the sake of it. I think especially today, in when we're in a more sort of like social media native sort of world, I think speaking out on issues has become synonymous to being a good person. Because I'm relatively vocal about social issues next to me, if I don't speak up about, for example, the farmers' protests, people come at me and they're like, why aren't you speaking up about this? You know, it's become like, I think what aboutery has become like the national sport of India, right? But I think that's when it's very important for youth activists, or I think anybody, to acknowledge, to understand when it's your safe, like when it's your space to take, and when it's not, when you should let those with the lived experiences really take that space, amplify their voices if you need to, but don't take their stage away from them.
Well, I don't think anyone could have put that in a better way. Thank you for that. Very, very true as well. And I think what should be appreciated, especially in your case, is that you recognize that you have that privilege, and then over and above that, you're actually doing something about it. Because there are many people who, at the end of the day, recognize their privilege and do nothing about it, which is also something that it's something that's good. It's something that at least you're trying to do something better, and also about speaking out when only when needed, and speaking to people rather than speaking on their behalf, especially when they come from systematically oppressed communities. That's um, really, really wise words on your part. And it's almost hard to believe that you're still a grade 12 student, though I'm not much older than you, admittedly. So, okay, let's move on to Rishi. So, Rishi, what exactly does the BNP do? What is the Navayuva, and what's your role with them?
So the BNP, or the Bengaluru Navanirmana Party, was formed about a year ago by a lot of citizens who were in this space of activism very specific to the city. So people were part of different movements like the Steel Flyover Beda movement, or say the Citizens for Bengaluru. Or even if they weren't part, they were supporting all of these movements. And these citizens realized that um, it's been happening for a long time, that the same reasons are being used. The same elected representatives at the most local levels are, underperforming, not doing their job. And they realized that it's been a long time that we have just been on the sidelines, where we've been advocating, advising, giving recommendations, but we haven't really picked up the mantle ourselves. So with that vision, the political party was formed as a political party, and not just another citizen group, with the aim to get good citizens elected as corporators or members of the BBMP, which is Bangalore's municipal corporation. And we want good citizens elected only at this level. So it's in fact the only political party in the country, and perhaps the world, for all we know. We haven't yet heard of another political party which says that their only focus is one city and one level, which is local governance. So that's what the BNP does. I told you before that I was really sold on the idea of decentralization and just taking care of our own surroundings, and bringing up systemic change ground up. So that's why I'm here. With Navayuva, I started it off not too long back, because I might be, of all our panelists, I might have been part of my organization for the shortest time. So in this period of, say, the last 2-3 months, we've been able to get about 70 plus youngsters who have said that they want to take charge of our city and impact it in different ways. We even have youngsters who are under the age of 30, about 10 already, who have said that they will contest the upcoming elections. And that's one of the best things that can happen, because changes won't happen overnight, but we need youngsters to start getting into the mainstream. So if I want to conclude this entire idea of being in the mainstream versus being an activist on the periphery, how I look at it is like it's a circle. So the entire status quo is one spherical bubble which exists in its own way, and it's been existing like this for a long time. So when will that bubble burst? When will we be able to break that circle, that loop of endless things that are happening? When pressure is applied from both sides. And this is what I think, this is what largely we all believe in the organization. So we have been seeing tremendous work by these citizen groups in Bangalore, by NGOs, by student communities, brilliant work by activists, even social media activism. All of them are pushing in to the status quo from the outside. What we want to do is get right in the center and start pushing out from inside. So when there's this synergetic, flow, synergetic, like value that we can generate with people pushing from both sides, and that's when the bubble will burst at some point. So can we say that we will bring about this change of, say, getting citizens into the system overnight? No, absolutely not. But do we see it happening in, say, 5 years, in 10 years? Definitely. And again, a last concluding remark is, I know that results are hard to come when youngsters are involved, when citizens are involved, especially in the political space. But I strongly believe that this process is something that's really worth committing to, and that's what we do.
Right, Rishi. So you spoke about having people below the age of 30 and involving them in contesting for elections. And let's say hypothetically they win. Now these are people below the age of 30, probably just getting into their careers, if not for having contested the elections. How do you convince and sustain people our age, not much older than us, to actually contest for elections and be a completely honest politician, which is something that you don't see often in India. Keeping in mind that salaries for BBMP corporators are extremely low, abysmally low, to be honest, around 7,500 rupees a month, if I'm not mistaken, which we know that in a city like Bangalore is not one bit sustainable to live in. So how do you convince people of our age to take up this role and also remain honest and maintain the integrity, which is something that the BNP is a huge advocate for?
That's a really hard question, to be honest. How I look at this entire political party and what we are trying to do is very similar to how we look at a startup. So the same questions are asked of any startup that comes through. How are you going to change the mindset? How are you going to put in a new product that nobody knows? How are you going to get the consumers? How are you even going to attract the right kind of people for your startup, for your organization, for it to grow? So the same way I look at this as a political startup. And in the business world, we have this 80-20 rule, which says that 80% of anything has to be done by 20% of the people. So where we are right now is we are that 20% which are trying to break the first 80% of the barrier. And that's how things are going to happen. Specific to salaries, allowances, it is a hard thing. And tying back to what Anjali said, people who start off this process, the first few youngsters were able to get in through the system, and youngsters have done it before. There's been someone previously, 22, 23 being elected to municipal bodies. The only thing is it's not been the norm. And these people might have been coming in from political backgrounds, which means that the access they had might have been a lot greater. But for this movement to start it off, this is the way it's going to work. It's going to take a first few people who've been sacrificing all their time, everything they had for the first year. So yes, we won't have thousands of such people. For example, in BNP today, we might have 3,000 members, supporters, but the very strong leaders who are giving, their entire day might be in about 200, 300 of them, maybe even fewer when you look at their commitment. But it's this initial group that's going to make the inroads. Once the barrier is broken and, the bubble is burst, it's going to be a lot more easier for people to come in. Just like in a startup, say you'd be doing your own day job, but then you start working on an idea of yours. And then at one point, you're going to be convinced that this process is going to be worth it. And then you make the switch. Yes, it's very unfortunate. That being said, that the allowances are low. When we compare the political space in India as opposed to any other developed or developing country, the value that, say, policy studies have, which I can say as a public policy student, the value that policy studies have, that being someone in governance, being someone in administration has, it's actually quite low compared to the different countries. So people like me, people like all the other youngsters of Navayuva who are there today, who are saying that they can manage, they will make the sacrifices, they will enter the system. When these people are there, then I think we can again get into our activism from the center, from the system, looking at how we can increase allowances, how we can incentivize people to come be part of this process in a very transparent and like a fair manner. So I agree that your question is absolutely right. It's a hard one to do, but we'll get there.
Right. Um, so I have another question, and even the other panelists, both here and online, can chip in and answer this. But Rishi, you spoke about the role of youngsters in politics. So why do people of our age want to get into politics? Is it some sort of a reactionary state against the current stakeholders who probably aren't efficient, and or at your level probably the corporators who aren't building our roads? We have unnecessary projects, a lot of corruption. So so is it a sort of way in which people our age us are telling the older generation, look, you have messed up, and we are now going to come and try and solve it at a much younger age, because you don't typically hear of cooperators in this age group. You don't typically hear of people like Dhruv who virtually took over the palace grounds during the COVID pandemic while feeding migrant workers. So what gets people into politics and activism according to you? This question is open for the entire panel. So I go first? Excuse me.
Yeah, so in fact, I don't even know if I completely agree that there are a lot of youngsters who want to get into politics. So that's part of the challenge that we are solving, both at BNP, but also specifically to Navayuva and the youngsters. Um, the reason, in fact, I will say that many youngsters or many people are averse to doing something explicitly political. In fact, just like you, I believe that when we're starting to do something political, everyone will be interested because we see political chatter everywhere. We see youngsters putting up stories and using social media to raise their voice. So even I was under the assumption that it'll be very easy to get youngsters to come and be part of this. But when we say something is political, people actually have an aversion to it. For instance, if I have to go and get permission to do an event at one of the just public places in Bangalore, it's really hard because they say that, look, if you're doing some awareness or some work with an NGO, we'd allow you, but we don't want anything to do which is political. We go to some civic forums which have been doing good work in their own surrounding areas, and we say that we want to use your platform to get our message out as youngsters or as the party, and they say, no, we'll support you, we love your idea, we'll even come vote for you, but we don't want to explicitly associate with this. And I found it really funny. There are people who are coming and saying, I love your cause so much, I will support you personally, I'll even give you my time, I'll volunteer, I'll do all the work, but just don't call me a party member or a party worker. So on a more serious note, the reason I think these things happen is that what let's just say, what does politics mean in the contemporary sense in our country? We have politics to win elections. How do you win elections? You win elections by securing your vote banks, getting people to vote for you. How do you get your vote banks? By separating people into different vote banks, and that's where the issue lies. So when we say politics, people think that it's going to amount to separation one way or the other, and they are not wrong, and this is what's happening at the larger state and national elections. So this is something that we need to change, and I'm not sure how well we'll be able to do that, because I then became self-aware. We are also using the same language. We are saying that us youngsters versus them old inefficient politicians, and we started saying us citizens who care about our city versus those politicians who have vested interests. So this segregating into us versus them seems inevitable in the political space, which is why more than support, I see an apprehension of people to join this space. But I think when we start reclaiming this entire separation of us versus them, whatever separation we are doing, identifying different groups, if we do it in a positive sense, such that we are not hurting people, we're not using it the wrong way, then I think we can see a lot of change. So yeah, with that, I'll leave it open to the other panelists.
So just to come in here, um, really short though. So let's face facts. Nobody is apolitical, to be fair enough. You could be in whichsoever profession as such, but politics affects you at some level or the other, from being a farmer or to being a businessman. It's eventually the policies that are made that get to you. So I completely agree with what Rishi is saying over here. And with regard to what Sanjit has to say, it's true. I mean, we have to motivate more people in this sphere, and the ideology of the youth, I believe, should be development than anything else, because that's what India needs at this point in time.
Right. So, what exactly do you mean when you say that development is most important for the youth? Like, what sort of development? Can you say it in that a bit?
Okay, so I'll just get to that. So, um, in my terms, development means I'll relate it a bit to my work. So, I live in an urban space. I've been exposed to different sorts of atmospheres, just like the other panelists and other people watching who have access to this very program. So, development in my terms means if you belong to this sort of urban space, you have the opportunity to do something. You've been educated. You're a part of, a process that is very much advanced. So this means going back and giving back to the rural areas where you build with policy work and that sort. So development is what I mean, where people can actually work in the rural sectors of India if India has to look forward, because these urban cities are eventually just very small pockets of what India consists of. It's the rural spaces that are eventually, what decides most of it, from it being our economy to our culture and other sorts. So people in urban spaces, I believe, must have the commitment to go to rural areas and work in those spaces.
But how would you probably incentivize people to do that?
It's very simple. Incentivizing it is basically a mechanism that's required. So this mechanism is something that India, and I'll take it in the context of Karnataka, which doesn't exist. I've come across many people who are very motivated in order to, do something for society, do something in the rural areas, but there isn't a fixed mechanism that exists. So similar to that is what we plan on doing from our 2021 project, for example, is where we're going to bridge a gap where people from Bangalore urban students go to different areas, North Karnataka, for example, in order to improve the education process. We also plan on tackling a couple of SDGs in coastal Karnataka, life below water, where we give students the opportunity to get the first-hand experience to work and research on ground itself. So this is the sort of mechanism that we build on creating, which incentivizes students to work towards the development of rural areas.
Right. And in one of our discussions before coming here, you spoke about redefining the definition or concept of Indian youth, and I found that pretty intriguing. So, what exactly do you mean by that?
Okay, so I'll just give you a bit context to this. The UN in 1985 put the age bracket for youth between 15 to 24. The UN General Assembly passed a resolution 50 by 81 in 1995, which reiterated the same fact that the definition of youth is between the age from 15 to 24. The same document went on to explain four main components, which one explains the involvement of youth in economic activities, in political participation, in decision making, something which even Anjali had mentioned earlier, and also distribution of powers. So this is what the UN had come up with. So now when we take that into context of India, how many people between the age of actually 15 to 24 are active in these fields? You see major political organizations, youth specific, have presidents and committee member workers who are at the age of 30 or even 40. So, I mean, where is that sort of connect between the people? It's what I would say very much missing over here, because the more you disintegrate the youth from the actual process, the actual youth, I'm saying, is it's going to be difficult. So, if you actually see the UNDP estimated in by 2020 by 2050 that 1,176 people, 76 billion people will be between the age groups of 15 to 24. So it again puts a big question mark as to whether within our system are we encouraging the right age group to grow, because the more the connect this gets a bit more wider, it becomes difficult in the coming years for us to work with the youth.
Right. And you've previously spoken about freedom of thinking within the youth community. So, do you think that in a country like ours, where a lot of notions are literally prescribed and expected by people, and one of those notions being do not question your parents, do not question authority, just follow what your elders tell you. So, what do you think is the state of affairs of the freedom of thinking among youth, and what's its impact on activism and probably politics, or just activism in your case?
Freedom of thinking, for example, within the youth is a very important concept because in the past we've seen a lot of radical organizations from different communities taking over students and children at a very young age, and working towards extremism, which becomes a huge question. And to get it more at a societal level, if we had to see at home, we all have parents; they have political ideologies as well. We often see that they're in a process of pushing their children in that sort of thinking. So that's something I completely discourage. I believe that every individual must have the capacity to comprehend their own sort of thinking towards a specific policy or a specific ideology. The freedom is very much required. If a person is inclined towards a specific thinking and that's something that he believes in, then I truly agree that if that he should take it up. So that's where I feel freedom comes as a very important concept over here.
Right. If any of the other panelists would like to pitch in, based on your experience, uh, meeting many people, going out and working in the field, do you think that the youth do not have that freedom nowadays, or is it, or do they even have opinions in the first place? What do you all think? Shreya?
So that in particular, I think is a huge issue in the space that I'm working in right now. Uh, because we are a student-led organization, because every full-time volunteer, every volunteer who is spending the same amount of time that any other adult would, um, there's a lot of age dynamics and power dynamics that come into play, especially when we are meeting with different administrators, different authorities. Um, the natural, like the instinctive reaction that we have is, you're just 19, what would you know, right? Like, we've been in this space for like 20 years, 30 years. How is it that a student who's just 18, 19 would know more than us? So a lot of times we need to speak really loudly for us to be heard. But what has helped us and has really secured our place in the system is just being honest and doing the groundwork sincerely. I think letting the work speak for itself is something that has helped us throughout this process. And like just coming to what Drew was mentioning, I genuinely do think that every individual, every citizen, every young adult must have um, their own opinion of different policies and like he mentioned, I don't think any of us are truly apolitical. And in the space that we're working, once again, I feel the children that we spend time with don't even realize that this is something that they must have as they grow up, as they enter into the real world. When we work on our 21st century skill building curriculum, I think this is something that we do focus on for them to be vocal, for them to understand what they support, what their stance is on different political matters.
Right. And on that point of administrators or stakeholders not taking you seriously, do you think that even being a woman in activism, or in your case, a woman in activism, or in cases for other people, probably them being non-binary, not identifying with the not identifying with the mainstream identities. Do you think that also is a hindrance or plays a role in, one, involving them in activism, and two, being able to execute whatever they want to do as efficiently and being taken seriously?
So personally, like for me, I resonate with Anjali. I do come from a privileged background where there has never been discrimination on the basis of gender or any other kind like that. But I can speak for some of the children that we've been working with. Um, Not going to take names, but so there was this one young girl who was 14 years of age. She wrote her class 10 examination and she didn't. She was in the Karnataka SSLC board. She didn't clear her exam, and the natural process that we follow in other institutions is they have, I think, like a month and a half to appear for their supplementary examination, and then they clear that and move on to their first PUC. But what happened with this girl was that she went back to her hometown because it was summer and she hadn't like seen her family for a long time. Once she was sent back, her family found out that she hadn't cleared her exam, and she was supposed to come back within a week, but she never showed up, and we like kept trying to follow up. Of course, we have to maintain our boundaries. We can't keep calling her family up. Uh, and I think around 3 weeks after that, we found out from someone in her village who also works in the same organization that she had been married off to the driver in their locality. And and we're talking about so many different issues here because one, she was 14 or 15, and that's child marriage, which is uh, completely illegal. And if you're also looking at it from a biological perspective, soon she would be expected to bear children, and your body isn't even really mature to go through a stage like this, biologically speaking. Mentally speaking, you're not in a position to start a family, to play the role of a wife, to play the role of a mother. And I know for a fact that she wanted to study, and that's why we were working with her. We worked with her for almost a year. So when you're looking at it this way, I think she didn't have a say in this at all because um, from the family she comes from the society she lives in, I think it wasn't expected for a girl like her to get good education, go into the space, and then work and make a living for herself. So when we're talking about gender playing a role, I think it's very prevalent in people in the communities which are underserved, if I can call it that. Speaking as a woman in urban Bangalore with great education, family, and everything else that I could ask for, I personally haven't faced anything like that.
Right. And before probably moving on to Anjali, who I'm sure will have a couple of words to say about this, anyone in our audience, both in person at PIC as well as online on Zoom, you can ask us your questions at 6:30, which is 1 hour after we have begun our thing, our session. You can ask your questions via the Q&A option on Zoom, or even send us a message, and we will be entertaining those at 6:30. And those in our audience, you can come up and ask us your questions as well if you have anything. Right. Over to you, Anjali. What do you have to say about discrimination being faced by not only women in activism, but also those who are non-binary?
Yeah. Like, I mean, just echoing what Shreya said, of course, I come from a place of privilege. Um, but at the same time, it's not that I have not faced discrimination, however subtle it might be in my activism space. For example, I know cis men who are working in the mental health and hygiene space, and we're doing very similar work, and their voices are often spotlighted because it's a cis man who is working the mental health and hygiene space. And while that might be something that's new or unheard of, I think it's frustrating because and while I appreciate their efforts, right, it's just that they don't have the lived experiences that me and other menstruating women do, right? Um, and I think just building onto that as well, I think with social media, there comes the whole cancel culture. I think I've blocked at least 80 to 120 accounts in the past 8 months itself because of the amount of like hate messages I've received on Instagram, because a lot of our work, advocacy work happens on Instagram. And I think women get a disproportionate amount of hate. And I'm speaking statistically um, online. And I think a lot of it happens because it's online. It's very hard for you to come up to me in person and say, hey, you're dumb and you're stupid. But the virtual digital platform makes that a lot simpler because we often forget that the person sitting behind that screen is a real person, right? So I think, yeah, women in general get a disproportionate amount of hate online, which does deter um, the work that we're doing. But that said, I've personally also been like blessed with a lot of support, which makes it easy. But I know of like within our team itself, like I think a lot of our team members are active. They're vocal about issues that matter the most to them. And we have meetings because we're trying to create a safe space. And if somebody just wants to vent, they can come. And a lot more women are sharing stories about how they feel discriminated against or how they feel harassed online. So I think subtle differences like these definitely are present, no matter how privileged you are in terms of your socioeconomic background. Um, as for, and I think the same goes for those who do not identify um, as who don't identify as a cis woman or a cis man. I think they face a lot more discrimination, and it's a lot harder for them to be vocal about issues, for sure. But I think just adding on a little bit to the previous conversation, I think in context of our times, like for example 5 or 10 years back, I think the problem would be that the youth doesn't get enough platforms to speak. I think today I wouldn't entirely agree to that, because I think we have a lot of platforms. The fact that I'm addressing you all here today, Instagram, Facebook, blogs, there's a lot of platforms for the youth to speak. But now the problem is that there's nobody willing to listen. So I think I mean, even today, the questions I get most, it's not, hey, what inspired you to start Full Stop? It's not, why are you doing the work you're doing? It's very often from youth from members of Gen Z asking me, hey, how did you actually start it? What was what was the first step you took? What is the practical sort of functioning of your organization? How do I open a bank account? How do I get myself registered? So I think I don't think that there's a lack of incentive within the youth to do something for the greater good. I think it's just the lack of exposure to mechanisms that allow them to take action. And I think that's a really major gap that it's vital we fill. And I think in addition to that, I think what sets Gen Z apart is our emphasis on we instead of I. I know that when I'm going to be voting in the next elections, I'm not just thinking of myself or which political party is the best for me. I'm thinking of all the communities that my vote will impact, right? Because I think we make a distinction between charity and solidarity. I never think of the work I'm doing as charity, because that's vertical, and I believe in horizontal. I believe in solidarity, which is why I think this is one main differentiating factor between Gen Z and other generations that preceded us.
Absolutely. And I think what you said about so at the end of the day, behind a screen is a real person. That really struck me. And um, also the fact that in our cases, it's probably someone who's not even 18, not even an adult yet, or just about has reached the age of 18 and become an adult. And that's true. But at the same time, though, you do get a lot of hate on social media. And I think after a certain point of being successful or famous, you do start getting it, and it's one of the disadvantages of social media. But at the same time, what is the role of social media in youth activism today? And you also spoke a bit about cancel culture. So, what exactly are the impacts of of cancel culture on people taking to social media? Is it good? Is it bad? And yeah, what do you think about it?
I think this is gonna be, I think I can go on and on about this, because social media, I think it's so ironic, because I think it's tailor made for activism because of the reach it has, but it definitely has a lot of drawbacks to it. I think addressing the first part of your question, I think the reason why people spread hate online, and I'm trying to speak from like a perspective of empathy and compassion here, is because there's something going on in their lives, that they feel the need to channel their anger and frustration online, right? So I remember in the beginning of the year when I used to get hate or somebody used to be like, hey, feminism is cancer, I used to express outrage. I used to get angry very fast. But now what I do instead is I say, hey, I'm really sorry that you're going through trying times, that you felt the need to channel your anger on my social media. So here's a few resources that should make mental health easily accessible to you. And I list 4 NGOs that provide free mental health services, and I send that message to them. Because we need to understand, especially with respect to like women's rights and feminism, is that we're all a product of patriarchy. You know, we're all victims of patriarchy. Although it only oppresses women, we're all a part of that institution that is patriarchy, right? So the fact that you probably can't or have been conditioned into believing that you can't express your emotions, or you can't cry, or you have to man up, or you have to be like the hunter and not the gatherer of the family, that is how patriarchy is affecting you as well, right? And I think because of that, very often men don't have the safe spaces. Like, for example, on Instagram, and I'm echoing the words of somebody I really look up to called Nikhil Taneja, and I heard him say this in a panel, and this just resonated with me, so I'm sharing this now. You know, on Instagram, on a girl's post, you're most likely to see like fire emoji and like, yes, queen, like, you go girl kind of things, right? It'll be bombarded with that. But men don't have that. It's because of the whole notion that men are not supposed to channel their emotions. Um, and I think that takes away safe spaces from men, and they channel that frustration into feminism, which is why I think feminism is so misunderstood. I think that's the first part of your question. As for social media, I think Gen Z is so uniquely positioned because we grew up learning how to use Twitter and Facebook and Instagram alongside learning our alphabets, right? So I think we know how to weave social media with social justice, and that's allowing us to make waves of change. In fact, we're redefining how change making takes place. If you look at it, what does the Arab Spring, the Me Too movement, France's Yellow Vest movement, um, the Hong Kong airport protests, they all have something in common. And that is they represent this fast changing sort of face of power that is decentralized, that is social media fueled, that's disruptive. And that's the kind of approach that young audiences from across the world are taking. Um, so I think social media is so powerful in that sense. And also because it gives us a lot more exposure. I think, and while I completely agree with the statement that, you know, older generations who've been working in specific fields for a lot longer than I was born, in fact, they will have a lot more experience and knowledge. But I think what the youth can be is a great catalyst of change. And our lack of comparative knowledge should not take voices away from us, right? We care about issues because they directly impact us and will impact us in the future. Um, so I think the kind of exposure that we get because of social media is immense. Because I remember, okay, so like a month or two back, I was sending an email out, and in my signature I wrote Anjali Surana, founder, full stop, she, her, hers. And my mom was just confused, and she's like, why are you writing she, her, hers? It's because she doesn't have the exposure. um, so she's not on Instagram or Facebook, and she doesn't have as much exposure as I do to social media. So I think social media can be great for spreading awareness, but at the same time, I think it should not be the end all. It should complement the impact we want to have of outside of the digital space, but it should not substitute it. And I think that's one distinction is very important that anybody wanting to get into the activism space should understand.
Yeah, I think very, very valid points about social media complementing the work that you do rather than being I mean, you can argue that even a lot of activism can successfully be done on social media, but I think it to a certain extent it is important that it stands as a complementing job or work that you do, and that makes a lot of sense. Now, before I move on to my other panelists today, I just have one question for you. When you send those replies to those angry, often I'm assuming men in your DMs on Instagram, what do they reply back? They reply, do they block you? What are the reactions that you get?
So initially, when I used to send angry texts, it used to be like angry responses,
Yeah.
and I'd have to end up blocking them and things like that.
But what about when you
Mhm.
send uh, resources to mental health organizations and free counseling? What are the reactions you get to that?
Yeah. So now, as I said, I think when you acknowledge their message instead of just deleting the comment or things like that, it just hits them, because I think social media can be a little illusional. You just kind of forget, you're not in touch with reality, right? So when you acknowledge that message or when you respond to it, um, I think it just hits them that, like, hey, maybe what I'm doing is not the best thing to be doing. So I've gotten a mixed responses. Some people have just deleted their comments. Some people have just left me on red. Some people have, but the best ones have been when people have actually said sorry. They've said sorry. I apologize. I don't know whether they use those mental health resources or not, but I know one person did because it was a fake account, with like 0 followers and 0 following. So I knew it was made just to sort of send hate messages. Yeah, so I remember there was this one instance where I sent them that, and they started telling me the story. And although I definitely am not a mental health professional, and I don't want to um, exacerbate their mental health condition, and which is why I didn't provide any advice. But at the same time, I was just listening to them, and they just started ranting to me like, hey, you're right, something's going on in my life, this is going on. And I think we had a conversation about that, and that felt great because I think it's just so important for us to have empathy. And again, this is not to dictate. Okay, so it's easy for people from a point of privilege to say this because you're like, I hear this very often from men, like, hey, have empathy, but you're not the one getting rape threats, or you're not the one getting, I mean, you might as well, but like a disproportionate amount, right? So I don't want to dictate to anybody what your response should be to hate, but this is what I do. And I think this really works.
Wow, that's a very mature and smart response, and clearly it has worked for you as well, and that's good. What do the other panelists think about the role of social media at large?
Um, Well, yeah, I think I've been listening to all the conversations right from speaking about do we have the freedom of expression and all the way to hate, all the way to social media. So these three things that we were speaking about, and I had several thoughts on my mind. Um, One thing is that I have noticed is that as an activist or as anybody who's trying to bring about some change, you need to have a focus. There are enough number of problems in the world, in my country, in my society. It is up to me to pick which ones I'm going to solve. So a lot of these issues exist. For example, I do think that um, there is no ideal state of freedom of expression here, and in general, people like others to conform to their views. But that is not something I want to, break my head too much about, and that's not something that I want to solve because I feel like that problem has, no permanent solution. You probably get closer and closer to a state where there's free speech, but there's going to be no point where everyone's going to accept you for whatever opinion you're saying, and you're going to have that complete freedom. I'll give you an example. During I briefly mentioned my political experiences where I interned with multiple organizations, multiple individuals. I went to a academic institution where most of the ideology thought process were of one kind, and I so happened to be working with somebody else who was holding a valid government office from a different ideology, and I was very aware of that. But I still feel that that experience taught me so much more about what I dislike about the system, what are the areas I want to get into, and I do not regret that experience. But in that period where I was working with that person, a lot of my near and dear ones felt that I even had to cut off with a few people. I didn't do anything. They said that, look, if you're associating with someone who is of an ideology that's like different from ours, we think that you're supporting them, silently, and we do not want to stand with something like that. So I have seen a lot of these issues. There was one point where I was actually disappointed, thinking about what am I even doing. But now, in retrospect, when that entire situation is about a year behind, I feel that without that experience, I wouldn't have gained the kind of knowledge about the system, the administration, if I wasn't working with somebody in there. You won't believe it, yesterday I had a call with someone who said that, oh look, I invited someone to an orientation session you hosted. They loved your ideas, they loved what your organization stands for, but on your Instagram they saw an image of yours with this politician, therefore they don't want to associate with your cause. So at that point I was sitting and thinking, if my, even association, or I worked on a project with somebody somewhere a year ago, because of that you do not even want to listen to my ideas, I was convinced that there's going to be no state where everyone's going to be welcoming, welcoming all ideas. So that was my brief realization with, with hatred, with, the freedom to express your thoughts and say what you feel. I feel like it's a very important issue. It's not one that I'm going to even break my head about. I'm very action biased. I want to see that, like, we are getting into the system and doing as many things as possible. And if people have to say something, they will. But would you like to add anything else?
Yeah, so I can pretty much relate to what Rishi was saying. So, for example, on the personal space, I come from a political family which served the country at one of the highest levels in India. So I often get similar sort of treatment like what Rishi had to say. So yeah, with regard to freedom of expression and freedom within social media spaces and everything, it's sad that people try to put other ones down for no better reason. I see. For me, I get affiliated with different sort of ideologies, but for me, my ideology is just development of my state, Karnataka. So what's important to remember is that you must judge a person by the merit of what he or she is doing. So yeah, that's my opinion on this.
What about you, Shreya? Would you see as the role of social media and activism? Has it helped your organization?
So initially when we began Sitara, for believe it or not, for 1.5 years we had zero social media presence, because I was under the impression that, you know, we're doing work on ground. There's no need for us to go on the internet and be flashy about it. But I had this really good conversation with someone about how that's not the reason why NGOs get on social media. It's so that you put yourselves out there so that people can see your work, people can, like-minded people can get affiliated with what you do, people can get inspired, etc. And so we got onto social media only 6 months ago, and they're right. I feel the reach that we've had has just amplified since the time we got on Instagram and LinkedIn. But I think like there's a line that we need to keep in mind where the work that we're doing shouldn't be for social media. Social media is just a tool and it should not become the mechanism of your work. As long as that line is there, as long as you're able to stay within that line, I think it's a great tool to really reach out to more number of people and amplify your impact.
That being said, on a lighter note, I do need to acknowledge here that social media is a very important rule. I haven't figured it out yet. Most of all my panelists here have a better social media game than me or any of my organizations do. So I definitely want to catch hold of all of you outside and take some tips from how you manage to, get the audiences that you do.
Absolutely. All right. So it's been a little more than an hour since we started. So we will move into the Q&A session since I can see that a couple of questions have been posted on Zoom. Over the last hour, we've discussed the concept of privilege in activism, why people our age are into activism, what are the problems they face, discrimination, and also the role of social media, which is, I think, a very interesting topic. And I'm also at some level in agreement with Rishi that I do have a lot to learn from my co-panelists because I do not have a social media game at all. Though it's something that I think is important in any field because, as a matter of fact, even to convene today's panel, I've been in touch with Rishi for the last month or two, so you can sort of say that we know each other. But I think the rest of them are all through my social media connects. I've met Anjali once 2 years ago. and I got in touch with Dhruv and Shreya purely because of social media and the network, which is, I think, really important, especially in these fields when a lot of times our work at some point will intersect with each other. So that's great. Now I will be heading towards the computer to access the questions, and we shall begin our question and answer session. All right. So we have a couple of questions over here. All right. One second, please. All right. So this is a question that is addressed to no one in particular. So anyone can choose to answer it. Uh, how did you know when to take the first step to help the community in the various fields you all are interested in? Was there a particular moment, or I think in Drew's case, you did start during the pandemic because of the plight of migrant workers?
Yeah, so I'll take that, I guess. So yeah, with regard to what motivated us was the simple fact that we recognized the need on ground, and so we as a community could have simply dissolved right after the pandemic ended, but then we came to understand that our purpose as urban population students is very much to move into rural sectors and actually work on places where it's very much required. So that being one that in India, in Karnataka, there's a lot of scope for development, a lot of scope for youngsters to come up with their own ideas. Simple thing that we do is we tell each and every person of our community members, pick one sustainable development goal, pick one rural area, and see how you can make a change, and we will make sure that you do it.
Yeah. So when the question came up about motivation, not one specific incident didn't come to my mind, but I was largely thinking about what is it that motivates us, especially as youngsters, to say get into a cause that's larger than yourself. And I was thinking that I have this personal philosophy that I just remembered, that nothing is truly selfless. So even the most selfless of acts that you conceive are actually selfish in nature, but what you're really getting out of it is the satisfaction that you have attached to something else, which is a greater good. So for me personally, when I say that I want to see a better city tomorrow, am I being selfless that okay, I want the city to grow? I don't think so. I feel like I have a selfish interest in the betterment of the city. So when you ask me, am I doing charity? No, absolutely not. It's personal ambition, and the personal ambition is that I want to be the person bringing about some impact in the way local city politics works. So in terms of motivation, I feel like um, whenever I see youngsters who are getting involved in this process, or anybody else who has dedicated their lives to some sort of service, I think that it's because they attach some sort of value to a greater good. And why do I think people do that? I think that when you make your happiness or your utility entirely about what personally benefits you, or where you are the only beneficiary, the chances of you failing are higher. And I've seen a lot of failure. Most of my failures, when I look back, have come when the only beneficiary was me. When there was something that I want to do just for myself, or when it comes to people, if it's something I'm looking at just where I'm involved, where just I'm going to benefit, the chances of failure are higher. But the minute we associate with causes that are larger than ourselves, there is no absolute failure, because even the smallest of things that you do would have furthered the cause some way. So that's what I think about the motivation that drives us.
So coming to like how I figured out what the first, like when I realized I needed a step in this space, a very long time ago, back when I was in class 9, my mother, grandmother, and I went to a government school for like a Republic Day celebration. And we spent like half of the day with the children. And after that, like, on the way back home, my mom was telling me, I feel so fulfilled, I feel so satisfied after doing that. But that's not how I felt. And for me, it was why is it that we're feeling satisfied by just spending half a day out of like 365 days with them, right? That's when I knew that I wanted to do something, but not on an event basis. I wanted to do something on a regular, consistent basis. In fact, in Sitara, like if there's one thing that I've said to every single volunteer, it's always been, let's be biased towards consistent action. So that day like made me realize that I won't ever be fulfilled or satisfied or feel like I've given back when it's just doing something for my own pleasure and not really for the like Vishy mentioned. It's of course a lot of times there is some amount of I wouldn't call it selfishness for the lack of a better word. That's what I'm going to use. But you should also associate with the larger cause when you are working in this space.
Right. And we have a question that's being posed specifically to Rishi from Shishir SU. There is a popular opinion about politics that you have to be dirty in politics to survive, as one cannot survive being a prompt one. If you know good politics, then you have to know how to do bad politics too. What is your opinion about that? And politics is mostly based um, on various factors like caste, and there are political parties which have already their niche of their voters. So how do you plan to bring a progressive mindset among these people and communities to come out of this mindset of voting? I'll add a small addition to this question, which is in an urban setup. I do understand that probably at a national general election stage, a state election stage, caste religion does play a role, but in an urban setup, do you think it plays a role? And if yes, what's the role? If not,
Yeah, that was already a pretty long question, Sanjit. So with that addition, I think there's a lot to cover. If I have to simplify it in my mind, again, answering it specific to our context that we are working with, um, I don't think that you need to practice bad politics in order to practice good politics, but you definitely need to know what bad politics are, because that awareness is what even gives us the distinction between what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong. And my experiences have taught me this, and a lot of other people who came together for this cause have also come through having seen bad practices and realized that there is some scope for good practices. Now, speaking about the specifics, um, I don't think that we are at a stage where we can eliminate bad politics from the country or from the state. But I definitely think that there is scope to eliminate bad politics at the city level or at the local decentralized level. Why is it I say that? I'll give you the specific example of Bangalore itself. In order, if for example, our municipality has approximately 200 wards, and you have to get 200 citizens with the right attitude, with the right mindset in that position, in that system, so that they can control the resources in a fair and clean manner. All it takes to get these people there is actually a few thousand votes. So within the party, we have built an ethos where we are focusing just on local politics, just on mobilizing local groups, apartment communities, citizen forums, people who care not so much about the state or country or what's happening there, but what's happening in and around their surroundings. And we have built some really strong presences in some wards where people have come together and decided enough is enough. I will vote for whoever I want, whatever ideology for the chief minister or prime minister. But tomorrow, when there's an issue happening somewhere outside my household, outside my doorstep, it has to be a local citizen who takes it up and solves it. So with that, I do think that we are not being very idealistic. It is a realistic goal to be able to mobilize a few thousand votes and get citizens elected. We will not be able to clean up the entire country's politics. I'm very sorry. We will also not be able to clean up the state's politics. Someone else will have to do it, or a lot more such groups will have to come and do it. We will definitely, hope to clean up the city's politics for sure. And in an urban setting, I mean, just briefly adding to what Sanjit said, it is definitely possible, especially because of how close in proximity we are. So it is possible to reach a lot of people in a short span of time if your conscience is clear, your messaging is crisp, if you can put out what is it that you really want to do. We have seen take up, and I want to conclude this answer by saying that just today, this morning, I spent 3 hours at a public venue in Bangalore with a lot of walkers, joggers come with a few of my teammates from Navayuva, and we just spoke to random strangers. This is our idea of a Sunday morning. Go to a park, stand with some boards, asking people, do you want to see youngsters in politics? If yes, talk to us. and we spend a lot of time chatting. And the real confidence that we get is when a stranger who I've never seen before speaks to me for 5 minutes and says, you know what, I'm going to support whatever you're doing. So changes won't happen overnight, but I think we are going in that direction.
Right. Before I move on to the next few questions that we've received on Zoom, if there's anyone in the audience interested in asking a question, please do feel free to come up and ask your question. All right. Seeing none, we will, the floor is open. So at the end of every question, if you think you have another one, just raise your hand and I'll ask you to come forward and ask your question. Okay. Since we have spoken a lot about youth and activism, we have a sort of philosophical question from someone on Zoom. Does one need to be an activist to bring about change?
I'd love to answer this one.
Please do.
Yeah, so I think it depends on how you define activism.
I
For
was gonna
me, yeah, so I think for me, I think I consider myself an activist, and I think activism will always be a part of me. But that does not mean I want to go on to become an MP or run for PM, right? It's just that I don't think activism should change who you are. I think it should come from who you are and your beliefs and how you want the world to see other people. So I think if there's some part of you that if you have a reason to wake up every morning or sometimes not sleep at all, and if you have a drive to bring a change about in your society, you inherently are an activist.
Right. And I think that sort of fits into the concept of decentralization that Shreya was talking about, or even what the BNP and Rishi do. But this is not only at the city level or a ward level, but this starts with each and every individual person. And yeah, absolutely. I think change begins from within. That's true. We have another question that is addressed to Rishi. It looks like the future cooperator is getting a lot of questions. Uh, how is the effort different from those political parties that engage the youth? And he's given the question that how is the effort of the WBA, the youth wing of the BNP, different from other political parties?
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to be identified as, in fact, the person who's responsible for a lot more young cooperators coming into the system. Need not be me, but again, that's about the cause. How is Navayuva different from any other youth wing, anything else that the political party is doing? Is again the focus. Conventional youth wings, what they do is they build up a base that either propagates your message on social media, or if you have an event, they just the force that you just call on, and you can conduct protests and do things that need masses. But that's not the way we are growing in. For instance, there was an issue that came up recently regarding some protests that students were doing in the city, and someone came and said, "Hey, do you want to? We should also do something. We should also put something out." And we said, no, absolutely not. Let's stay clear with our focus. We, as individuals, we are free to go participate, help anybody, but let's keep the sanctity of our cause to what we are doing. And this is one way in making sure that the purity remains in the cause. There is a harmful effect of this. The harmful effect is we're not going to grow exponentially. The reason we're just at 70 people and maybe not 500 people, where it would have been easy to reach 500 youngsters, is because of this specific cause. Because if you're ready to go out there and do anything and everything possible to reach huge numbers of people in the political space at this point, it would have been easy. And this is what other youth wings do. But we are focusing more on quality, not just of people, but quality of work. Quality of intention. So I'm not saying that in terms of background. We do have a very good diversity, right from trans member all the way to youngsters, people from different class backgrounds. That is an attempt, but we want to ensure the quality of work. So that's how we are different. Right. If I may add another thing, actually ties back to something that Dhruv said very interestingly, lowering the bar of what you consider as age. And I hadn't thought of that before today, because when we say youth wing, we think that what we see outside is 35, 40, maybe even greater than that being called as youth. So it's very important to reclaim what you call as youth. And I didn't realize we were doing that. But after Dhruv articulated it, we realized that that's also something we want to do. We said that youth is 21 and up. So if you're 21, the constitution allows you to contest an election, which means that you have all the rights to do that. And we want to see people taking that up. So thanks, Dhruv, for telling me about phrasing it that way.
Right. So this is a question that I think has been asked by a concerned parent because of the amount we spoke about social media and its role. And I don't know exactly if you can answer this question or not, but is there by any chance a movement within the youth community that addresses excess use of social media? It's a very open-ended question, but are you aware of it? Like, I'm not.
Not too sure I've come across something at that such yet. So yeah.
One movement I can think of, a very famous one by a very noted global corporation by the name of Apple, is this concept called screen time, where you keep track of how much you're using it. No, but I'm just kidding. I don't know anything.
But I'm pretty sure that might be a moment that a lot of parents can come together.
Can come together. Probably not going to be the youth involved in activism this time, but we could have parents as well coming in. Right. So I do not see any further questions being put up on Zoom. And if there are any questions at all that the audience wishes to ask, now is a great time to come up and ask us a question. All right. All right. I've just been informed that there's another question, so I will be going to the computer.
I think having a movement to cut down social media time is even harder in the times that we are. And we're really sorry if the youngsters, your children, are glued to these, to their screens watching us speak for an hour and a half. It's probably adding to the issue.
Absolutely. All right. So we do have another question from a 17-year-old attendee of this session. Thank you for attending. I'm 17 years old and I want to get into the activism field and go into feminism in specific. What is your advice? I think it's a really good question, and I'm sure all our panelists have something to say at least. Shall we begin with Shreya, probably?
Thanks for mentioning your age. I think what's like, I don't want to preach, but one thing that you could do is identify what about feminism or any other cause it is that you personally feel is a problem that is impacting your life. And if you feel there's nothing as such, then someone near or dear to you. The moment you have something that you identify with, there's you don't really have to look for any external motivation for you to work towards it, because when the cause is personal, I think intrinsically you're very motivated to go out of your way and do whatever you can to bridge it. If we're going specific to feminism, I feel Anjali might be the better person here to answer that.
I completely agree with Shreya though. I think make the cause personal, because then you wouldn't need any external motivation, as you so rightly just stated. I think apart from that, and I'll just share one small anecdote here. So I remember a few months back, I was on a panel and one girl stated that she is pro-life. And as somebody who's pro-choice, I got very triggered and I dismissed her instantly. And then later, and in fact, I already had all my counter arguments ready. I didn't even want to listen to her. I just wanted to respond. But then she went on to justify her stance, and she's like, I'm pro-life, given access to free contraception, given that there's an adequate foster care system, given that there are exceptions made in the cases of life threat to the mother or rape and sexual assault. And although I don't entirely agree with her, a lot of what she was saying made sense to me, and I could finally, I was able to connect where she was coming from. So I think, again, also because we've spoken so much about social media, I think one major drawback of social media is the formation of epistemic bubbles or echo chambers, which is essentially that you're caught up in your own bubble. And what happens is Like I personally, I follow like 100 plus like feminism pages on Instagram, right? And when I'm constantly seeing something that's, pro-choice, and I get super overconfident in the validity of my opinions, right? And I think that can be very harmful. And I think this is further exacerbated by algorithms on the internet. For example, if I search Indian politics on Google, my results will be a lot more left-leaning media as compared to somebody who leans towards the right. Because that's just how social media algorithms are functioning at this point of time. They they tailor your search results based on your browsing history, right? So I think it's very important to escape these bubbles, and how you can do that is simply by exposure. So expose yourself to different points of views, be open to different points of views, and engage in healthy dialogue only after you have considered, I think, different points of views. Because I don't think you having strong opinions should stagnate you. I think it should help you grow because you're open to new ones. So yeah, that's just my 2 cents on that.
Absolutely. That does make a lot of sense. Okay, we have another question from the audience. Uh,
Hello, guys. It was wonderful listening to your thoughts, and it is so overwhelming to see that how serious you are about to change the nation you are in and your thought process. Having said that, I know getting involved in politics is something that's not very easy. Having said that, I just wanted to add one question which is interrelated to one another. How do you feel about secularism, and what are your plans to change it, or actually, it's a different views, but how do you see it and how do you want it to be represented?
As in, if there was a question that I actually didn't want to spend too much time speaking about, or like maybe thinking out, it would be this, simply because of the kind of sharp focus that I want to maintain to my cause. I think, um, I mean, the word secular is there in our constitution. That is also debated because it was added in by an amendment. There's a lot of history that's gone behind, how it came into existence, how the countries shaped up, how things got to the way they are today. And I just feel that I'm not read enough, educated enough, experienced enough to make comments on issues like that. I think that I'm very capable of taking care of our city and its local issues, and I want to maintain my focus. Absolutely.
Anybody would like to add with it?
Or with regard to this, I think that secularism is some sort of a concept that many shy away from. It's something that is very clearly put out in our constitution, and its values that we've carried on for years. History for a long time has been misinterpreted in modern times, which is so unfortunate. Um, so again, it comes back to what I think in a way is that the ideology of a person in a country like India, which requires a lot of progressive development, should be the urge to just work on developing areas that are in need.
right.
Yeah, just addressing the part where you asked, what are you guys trying to do to change it, or do you have any plans of doing something like that? At the central level, of course, that's not something that I can directly get involved with. But there is something that I feel we all can do, given our capacity, and that is in our own households, in our own families, are we really being secular in our thinking, right? So when I have discussions with my mother, my father, my sister, a lot of times when it's not even a political discussion, you can see there are biases. You can see there are already certain preconceived notions about different religions, about different political parties. As an individual, the least that I can do is engage in a meaningful or a healthy discussion then and there, and bring out what I think secularism is about. And that's something that I've actively been trying to do within my own family, because we are four people who have four different diverse opinions. And that's, I think, change can really begin at home. If you really do want to address something like secularism, you can start with just speaking with your own family.
Right. Thank you so much for your question. And I think we are running out of time. So thank you. Yes. So we have reached the end of today's event in which we spoke about various things related to youth and activism and how and our panelists spoke to us about redefining the age, their motives, interests, experiences, and both the positives and the negatives. And we also spoke about the role of social media at large. So, on behalf of the Bangalore International Center, thank you so much for attending today's talk, episode 2 in the Young Adult series. We will be coming out with more in the coming few weeks. Please do stay tuned and do watch our other episodes as well that are all recorded and uploaded on YouTube. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thinking and feeling youth is the true asset of any community, I think. And here we see 4 distinct faces of youth, that is feeling, thinking, and acting on what they feel and think. And I'm just gobsmacked in a good way. Uh, and maybe in the next 20 years, we'll all look back on this when you're not so young and not be surprised or disappointed. And we already have 2 diplomats in the making, I see. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Rishi. Thank you, Shreya, Dhruv, Anjali, and of course, Sanjit for tying this conversation together. And thank you, everyone who joined us in the auditorium physically with your masks on and everybody on Zoom as well. Thank you for your time and good night and see you next time.